What would you do if, in the middle of a Christmas service, the person you trusted most stood up and revealed a secret so devastating it shattered not only your world, but an entire church's? This is the unbelievable story of Emma Peterson, who exposed her husband's hidden second family in front of a stunned congregation, and that was only the beginning. On Christmas Eve, the serene heart of Maple Grove buzzed with festive spirit. Families gathered at the local church, the warmth of candlelight illuminating their joyful faces as they sang carols. Among them sat Emma Peterson, hand in hand with her husband David, the picture of a devoted couple. But beneath Emma's calm demeanor, a storm brewed, fed by months of growing suspicions. The pastor called the congregation to prayer, but Emma stood, her voice cutting through the hushed silence like a knife. "I know your secret, David." The room froze, every breath held, every eye locked on them. Emma's words were like an earthquake that shattered the peaceful facade of the evening. She pointed across the church. "They're sitting right there." All eyes followed her gesture to another woman, Jessica Walters, and two children seated quietly on the other side of the room. The truth unfurled. David wasn't just leading a double life. He was maintaining two families, each unaware of the other's existence. Gasps echoed through the congregation. Murmurs rippled like a wave, disbelief washing over everyone present. David sat in stunned silence, his carefully crafted world crumbling before him. Emma's voice, steady but seething, carried the weight of months of betrayal. "How long did you think you could keep this up, David?" What was meant to be a night of peace had unraveled into one of scandal, heartbreak, and public humiliation. Emma had ripped open a wound no apology could heal, exposing a truth that left the entire church reeling. As the silence settled, the question hanging in the air was, what other secrets was David hiding? This was not just a case of infidelity, it was a story of manipulation and control. The lengths to which David had gone to maintain his illusion of a perfect life, until now when it all came crashing down, right in the house of God. As the weight of Emma's revelation settled, chaos erupted in the church. Whispers filled the sanctuary, growing louder with every passing second. Families exchanged stunned glances, some in disbelief, others in hushed sympathy for Emma and Jessica. The air, thick with tension, was punctuated by the distant hum of Christmas carols from outside, a painful reminder of what the evening was supposed to have been. David, still seated, fumbled for words. "Emma, please." "Not like this," he whispered, his voice breaking. But Emma's gaze was unwavering, her rage simmering just beneath the surface. Jessica, equally blindsided, clutched her children close, her face pale and trembling. "I didn't know," she whispered to Emma from across the room, her voice barely audible. Emma gave her a bitter, exhausted smile, knowing they were both victims of the same web of deceit. Sensing the situation could spiral further, a member of the congregation discreetly slipped out and called the police. Minutes later, two officers entered the church. The sight of their uniforms only intensified the unease. Emma folded her arms and glared at David. "It's over, David. No more lies." The officers approached cautiously, aware that they had walked into a highly charged situation. "Sir," one of them said calmly, "we need you to come with us." David attempted to reason with them, but his voice was shaky and unconvincing. "I just need to explain. This is a misunderstanding." But the officers were unmoved. One gently took his arm. "Let's step outside, away from the children." David resisted for a brief moment, casting a helpless glance toward Emma, but the officers tightened their hold slightly. "Come on, let's not make this harder," one officer said firmly. With his head lowered, David allowed himself to be escorted out, his two separate lives now fused into a single, overwhelming reality. As the heavy church doors closed behind him, the sanctuary came back to life. Conversations resumed, whispered yet urgent. People debated the shocking scene they had just witnessed, some expressing anger, others pity for the two women caught in David's deception. Emma lingered for a moment, looking toward Jessica, who sat with her children huddled close, as if clinging to some semblance of normalcy. "I thought I was his only family," Emma whispered. Jessica gave a small, devastated nod. "So did I." The slamming of the police car door outside punctuated the surreal evening. From that moment, it was clear that the quiet life David had so meticulously curated was shattered beyond repair, leaving behind emotional wreckage that would take much longer to sort through. Emma knew, however, that this was just the beginning. A decade of lies had unraveled in one night, but now the real questions remained. What else had David been hiding, and how far did his betrayals extend? Emma was determined to find out, no matter the cost. Later that night, Emma sat in the church hall, the festive decorations around her now feeling hollow and ironic. The scent of pine and cinnamon lingered in the air, but any warmth the evening had once promised was long gone. She clutched a cup of cold coffee, her hands trembling, not from the chill, but from the emotional exhaustion. Across from her sat Detective David Harper, a seasoned investigator with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor. He flipped open his notebook. "Emma, I know this is overwhelming, but we need to understand everything. When did you first start suspecting something was off?" Emma exhaled slowly, gathering her thoughts. It started small. He'd go on business trips that seemed longer than necessary. At first, I didn't question it. He said work was stressful, but then he became secretive. He'd leave the room to take phone calls, brush off my questions. I thought it was just the pressure from work, until I found the pictures. Harper raised an eyebrow. "What kind of pictures?" Emma stared into her coffee, the painful memory fresh in her mind. Photos of him with Jessica, with her kids. They looked happy, like a family. She clenched the cup tighter, the betrayal hitting her again like a wave. That's when it all started falling apart. Meanwhile, in a smaller room down the hall, Detective Sarah Miller sat across from Jessica Walters, the other woman in David's life. Jessica looked pale and worn, her eyes glassy from crying. "He told me he was divorced," Jessica whispered, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her coat. "He said he didn't speak to his ex-wife anymore. I had no reason to doubt him. We were even planning to get married. I thought we were building a future." Miller leaned forward slightly. "So you had no idea he was still married to Emma?" Jessica shook her head. "None. I thought I was his only family. I can't believe I've been living a lie." Both detectives shared a similar realization. David had managed to manipulate both women masterfully. They weren't just dealing with a case of infidelity. This was a carefully constructed double life, meticulously maintained for years. After finishing their interviews, Harper and Miller regrouped in the church hall. "This goes beyond a family betrayal," Harper muttered, scribbling notes. "There's something deeper here. A man doesn't keep two families hidden for over a decade without leaving traces." Miller nodded. "We need to dig into his financials. If he's been balancing two households, there has to be a paper trail." They agreed to look into David's bank accounts, phone records, and travel history. Emma had given them access to some of his documents, and Jessica had provided additional details. They suspected that David's lies extended far beyond emotional betrayal. There were financial elements that needed unraveling. In the meantime, Harper approached Emma again. "I know this is tough, but I need you to stay somewhere safe for the next few days. We're not sure how far this situation stretches." Emma gave him a questioning look. "Is there something you're not telling me? Is this about more than just another family?" Harper hesitated but decided to be honest. "It might be. We're still figuring it out, but it looks like David's been involved in more than just personal deception. We need time to understand the full scope." Emma's expression hardened, the emotional weight of the evening settling heavily on her shoulders. "Whatever it takes, Detective. I want the truth." The detectives left the church that night, their minds already spinning with questions. How had David managed to live two parallel lives for so long without arousing suspicion? What else was he hiding? And most importantly, what was his endgame? The investigation was just beginning, and they both knew this wouldn't be a simple case. Lies had a way of spreading, and every thread they pulled might lead to something much darker. Harper and Miller had no idea how deep the rabbit hole would go, but they were prepared to find out. The morning after Christmas, Harper and Miller plunged headfirst into David's financial records. What they uncovered was a web of deception more elaborate than they had initially imagined. David had opened multiple accounts under different aliases, some shared with Emma, others with Jessica. Yet hidden among these accounts were several with unexplained deposits and suspicious transactions. He wasn't just juggling two families, Miller observed, tapping her pen on a spreadsheet. He was funneling money into places neither of them knew about. Harper scrolled through transaction records. Some of these withdrawals are disguised as business expenses, hotels, flights, and gifts. Look here, this charge matches a hotel stay in Jessica's town, the same day Emma said he was supposed to be at a conference. They realized that David had managed his deception with almost surgical precision. He scheduled business trips that doubled as secret visits to Jessica and her children. Every detail was coordinated. Gifts for one family delivered on different days, phone calls perfectly timed so that the women's paths never crossed. For over a decade, he had lived two separate lives in perfect synchrony. Miller leaned back in her chair, a note of frustration in her voice. He's been doing this for years. No wonder he never slipped up. He's been treating this like a second job. Their investigation soon took a darker turn. As they sifted through David's records, they found loans taken out in Emma's and Jessica's names without their knowledge. Some funds had been siphoned into secret accounts, while others went toward luxuries neither woman had benefited from. This isn't just betrayal, Harper muttered, rubbing his temples. This is fraud. Miller frowned as she uncovered something even more unsettling. Payments to third-party companies that didn't seem legitimate. Look at these, she said, pointing to a series of payments flagged by the banks. He's been sending money to shell companies, places that only exist on paper. Harper's expression darkened. If these companies are fronts, this could be organized crime. We need to find out who's behind them. The detectives realized they were no longer dealing with just a personal scandal. David's financial dealings hinted at deeper criminal entanglements. Harper made a call to the Financial Crimes Unit, asking for assistance in tracing the shell companies. Within an hour, they had their answer. One of these companies, Blue Horizon Investments, is already on our radar, an analyst informed them. They specialize in laundering money and running fraudulent loan schemes. If David's involved with them, he's in serious trouble. Miller scanned the records with renewed urgency. These aren't just business partners. If David's been moving money for them, they'll expect it back. And if he can't deliver, Harper finished her thought, they won't be sending friendly reminders. The discovery of David's connection to Blue Horizon raised new alarming questions. Was he merely a participant in the scam, or had he gotten in too deep with people who wouldn't hesitate to use violence? And if he was trying to manage two families, why had he taken on such a dangerous side hustle? They needed more answers, and fast. The detectives put in requests for surveillance footage at locations where David's transactions had taken place: hotels, gas stations, and grocery stores. Sure enough, the footage painted a grim picture. David appeared with Jessica in one location, Emma in another, moving through both lives seamlessly. But there were gaps in the timeline, hours unaccounted for, suggesting David might have had other activities beyond his two families. Miller narrowed her eyes. He wasn't just balancing two lives. He was running from something, or someone. Then came the most damning discovery, a recent plane ticket to Mexico, booked under a different name. It was a one-way ticket, scheduled for New Year's Eve, only days away. Harper's stomach sank. He was planning to disappear. Miller crossed her arms, leaving everything and everyone behind. The detectives now had a new mission: find David before he could vanish, or worse, before those he owed caught up with him. The investigation had taken a dangerous turn. David Peterson wasn't just a man with a secret life. He was a man standing at the edge of disaster, and time was running out. As Harper and Miller dug deeper, the scope of David Peterson's lies began to expand beyond anything they had anticipated. What started as a personal betrayal had become a complex web of financial manipulation and criminal involvement. The detectives' investigation into Blue Horizon Investments revealed unsettling connections. They weren't dealing with ordinary fraud. Miller studied the flagged transactions carefully. These shell companies are linked to organized scams, fake businesses that lure people into taking loans they can't repay. They disappear as soon as the money is transferred. Harper leaned over her shoulder. If David was involved, this wasn't just about keeping two families afloat. He was running with criminals. The detectives cross-referenced David's accounts with known fraud operations in the area. One name surfaced repeatedly: George Martin, a notorious figure in the financial underworld. Martin was linked to Blue Horizon and had a reputation for recruiting desperate people into fraudulent loan schemes and for using intimidation when debts weren't paid on time. Martin's been laundering money through these shell companies, Miller murmured, her eyes on the documents. David must have taken out loans from them, thinking he could handle it, but now he's drowning. Harper exhaled sharply. If Martin was pulling the strings, David wasn't just a liar, he was a pawn, and we need to know how far Martin's reach goes. The urgency intensified as they found another disturbing clue. 2 weeks before the Christmas service, Blue Horizon had deposited a significant amount of cash into one of David's secret accounts. Within days, most of that money had been transferred out, some to Jessica to maintain the illusion of stability, and the rest to pay off mounting personal debts. Miller tapped her pen against the edge of her notebook. That deposit was a loan, and they were expecting it back. David knew he couldn't keep up. He was running out of time. The detectives knew that David's financial collapse had made him a target. Men like George Martin didn't give second chances. If David had failed to repay the loan, Blue Horizon wouldn't have waited long to collect, by any means necessary. Harper called Emma, his voice calm but serious. "Emma, I need to ask, did David seem stressed lately? Any mention of money problems?" Emma hesitated on the other end of the line. "He was anxious, more than usual. Kept saying everything would be fine, that he had things under control. But now that I think about it, he did get a few strange calls late at night. I thought it was just work." Harper exchanged a glance with Miller, his concern deepening. "Emma, listen to me carefully. We believe David's involved with dangerous people. Until we get this sorted out, I need you to stay somewhere safe." Emma's voice wavered. "You're saying this is bigger than just the second family?" "I'm afraid so," Harper admitted. "We'll figure this out, but we need time." With the pieces falling into place, the detectives knew they were in a race against time. If David's financial dealings with Blue Horizon had put him on their radar, it was only a matter of time before they came looking for him, and they wouldn't care who got caught in the crossfire. Harper and Miller shifted their focus to finding George Martin. They needed answers, fast. If David had taken money from Blue Horizon, they needed to know if Martin was hunting him. Later that afternoon, they tracked Martin to a bar on the outskirts of town, one of his known hangouts. Harper and Miller slid into a booth across from him, their expressions grim. Martin greeted them with a lazy smile, but his eyes gleamed with calculation. "Detectives," he said smoothly. "What brings you to my part of town?" Harper didn't waste time. "We're investigating David Peterson. His name's tied to suspicious financial activity, and so is yours." Martin's grin didn't falter, but his tone sharpened. "Can't say I know a David Peterson." Miller leaned forward, her voice low but firm. "We know about the loans, George. We know he owes you. Now tell us, how deep was he in?" Martin sighed, tapping his fingers on the table. "He was just another client, trying to dig himself out of a hole. He made bad choices. What else is new?" "And if he can't pay," Harper asked coldly, "what happens then?" Martin's grin widened, though it didn't reach his eyes. "That's between me and him. But if I were you, I'd be looking south. I hear David had plans for a little getaway." The detectives left the bar with more questions than answers. Martin wasn't going to cooperate, but his words confirmed their fears. David was running out of time, and someone dangerous was already on his trail. Back at the station, Harper pulled up surveillance footage from airports and bus terminals. It didn't take long to spot him. David, disguised with a hat and sunglasses, boarding a bus heading for the southern border. Miller stared at the screen, her mind racing. He's not just running from his lies, he's running for his life. The detectives knew they had to act quickly. David Peterson wasn't just a man with two families. He was a man caught in a dangerous game with no way out, and the clock was ticking. With David on the run and the threat of George Martin's involvement looming, Harper and Miller knew they had to move fast. The clock was ticking, and if they didn't catch David before he crossed the border, he might disappear for good. Worse still, if Martin's associates got to him first, they'd be dealing with more than just a missing person case. They put out alerts to airports, bus stations, and Border Patrol, flagging David as a person of interest. Every potential exit point was being monitored. It was a race not just to apprehend him, but to ensure his safety, for his sake, and for the answers they desperately needed. Hours later, Harper's phone buzzed. A state trooper on the highway had spotted David trying to board a long-haul bus heading south. Harper and Miller rushed to the station where David was being held, hoping they weren't too late. They found him slumped in a plastic chair, disheveled and exhausted, his attempt to disappear thwarted. He looked up as the detectives entered, his eyes hollow and filled with defeat. It was clear that he had run out of options. Harper crouched down to meet David's gaze. "You've run out of moves, David. Now's the time to talk." David exhaled slowly, his hands trembling in his lap. "I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I just needed to keep everything from falling apart." Miller leaned against the table, her arms folded. "You mean the lies? The loans? Or were you just running from George Martin?" David closed his eyes, the weight of his choices crashing down on him. It started small, just one loan to keep things going. But then Martin kept demanding more, and I couldn't keep up. I thought, if I could just get to Mexico, I'd figure it out. "So you plan to leave both families behind?" Harper's voice was calm but cutting. "Emma, Jessica, your kids, all of them." David's head dropped, his voice a whisper. "I didn't know what else to do." Harper pressed further. "Did you ever think about telling them? About coming clean?" David shook his head. "I thought I could protect them, but I couldn't even protect myself." The confession poured out like a broken dam. For years, David had balanced his two lives, hiding his debts, his fraud, and his dealings with Blue Horizon. But when the loans caught up with him, and the walls began to close in, he panicked. His plan was to escape, leaving everyone and everything behind. Miller's expression was cold. "And Martin? How involved was he?" David rubbed his face, the exhaustion visible in every movement. "He gave me the loans, but when I couldn't pay, he started making threats. I thought I had more time." Harper exchanged a glance with Miller. They had their answers. David wasn't just running from his lies. He was running for his life, hoping to escape both his crimes and the dangerous people he owed. As they processed David's arrest, Harper knew this was only half the battle. With David in custody, they needed to shift their focus to George Martin and Blue Horizon. The Financial Crimes Unit had already started piecing together the broader scheme, but they still had loose ends to tie up, and the danger hadn't passed. Later that night, Harper and Miller sat in the dimly lit briefing room, reviewing their case notes. David's confession gave them leverage, but Martin was still out there, a looming threat they couldn't ignore. Miller tapped her pen against the table thoughtfully. "Do you think Martin knows we've got David?" Harper shrugged. "If he doesn't yet, he will soon. And when he does, he won't be happy." The detectives decided to move quickly. They issued a formal request to bring Martin in for questioning, knowing full well that he wouldn't come quietly. Every moment counted, and if Martin suspected David had talked, things could escalate fast. Harper leaned back in his chair, exhausted but determined. "We've got David, but we still need to shut down Blue Horizon. This isn't over yet." Miller nodded, her expression grim. "Not by a long shot. With David's arrest, they had taken an important step, but the real fight was still ahead. They knew that until they took down the entire operation, the threat remained, and the lives of Emma, Jessica, and their children were still in the crosshairs. With David Peterson in custody, Harper and Miller knew they were only halfway through unraveling the tangled web of lies, crime, and betrayal. They needed to squeeze every last piece of information from David before George Martin or Blue Horizon retaliated. They were running out of time, not just to stop Martin, but to ensure the safety of Emma, Jessica, and anyone else caught in the crossfire. The next morning, Harper and Miller prepared to question David in a secured interrogation room. David sat across from them, looking smaller, his once carefully controlled demeanor shattered. His shoulders sagged under the weight of everything he had tried to hide. Miller leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "David, we need the truth. Everything. If you hold anything back, Martin will walk free, and we won't be able to protect you or your family." David exhaled sharply. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I swear. I just needed a way to keep everything together. Keep both families safe. His voice cracked. But when I took those loans, I didn't know what I was getting into. Then why take them? Harper pressed, his tone sharper. You had 2 families, plenty of debt, and you still made deals with criminals? David rubbed his temples. It was desperation. I thought, just one more loan, one more scheme, and I'd have enough to keep everyone happy. But Martin, he doesn't let go. Miller's gaze sharpened. Did Martin threaten you? David nodded slowly. At first it was just calls, reminders about payments. But when I missed the deadlines, he said he'd come for me, or worse, for Emma and Jessica. So that's why you ran, Harper muttered. Not just from your families, but from Martin. David swallowed hard. I knew I couldn't keep up with the payments, and I knew Martin wouldn't care who got hurt in the process. The one-way ticket, it was the only way out I could see. Harper's jaw tightened. And what about Emma and Jessica? Did you ever plan to take them with you? David shook his head. Number? They deserve better than this mess. I thought, maybe if I disappeared, they'd be free to move on. Miller crossed her arms, frustration flickering in her expression. Except that's not how things work, David. You forged their names on loans. If we hadn't caught you, their lives would have been destroyed. David dropped his head into his hands, guilt radiating off him. I didn't know what else to do. Everything kept spiraling, and I thought, if I could just get away, maybe things would stop falling apart. Miller stood, her tone cold. They were falling apart because you kept lying. After hours of questioning, the detectives pieced together the final threads of David's tangled scheme. It was worse than they initially thought. He had forged documents, taken out fraudulent loans, and funneled money into Blue Horizon's criminal network. The deeper David sank, the harder it became to extract himself, until the Christmas Eve confrontation forced everything to collapse at once. With David's full confession on record, Harper knew they had enough to charge him with multiple counts of fraud, forgery, and financial deception. But that wasn't enough. They needed to stop Martin and dismantle Blue Horizon before someone else became a victim of their schemes. Later that day, Harper and Miller returned to the station to strategize. Miller reviewed the connections between David's transactions and Martin's network. Martin has to know by now that we've got David. He's not going to wait around. Harper nodded grimly. We need to act fast. Hit Martin before he disappears. The detectives coordinated with the Financial Crimes Unit to track any recent activity from Blue Horizon. The investigation had already uncovered multiple fraudulent loans, and they were closing in on Martin's associates. Every new lead brought them closer to dismantling the operation. Harper's phone buzzed, and he glanced at the message. Got him. Martin's at one of his usual haunts. Let's move. They found George Martin lounging at the same bar where they had first questioned him, but this time, the detectives weren't here to chat. Harper and Miller approached him with backup, and Martin's expression darkened the moment he saw them. Detectives, Martin said smoothly, though tension rippled beneath his words. Back for another visit? Harper didn't waste time. George Martin, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud and involvement in organized crime. Martin's smug grin faltered as the officers cuffed him. You're making a mistake, he hissed. This isn't over. Miller gave him a cold smile. Oh, it's just beginning. Back at the station, Harper and Miller watched as Martin was processed. They knew this arrest was a major step toward dismantling Blue Horizon, but there was still work to do. The network ran deep, and they needed to ensure no one else could step in to take Martin's place. As Harper reviewed the final pieces of the case, he glanced at Miller. We've got David, and we've got Martin. Now we just need to make sure this whole operation comes crashing down. Miller nodded, her expression determined. This time, we take it all the way. The hunt for David Peterson might have ended, but the real fight, to protect his victims, dismantle the criminal network, and prevent further damage, was only just beginning. David Peterson's trial began just a few weeks after his arrest, but the media frenzy had already engulfed Maple Grove. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, and headlines screamed betrayal, fraud, and double lives. The community was divided. Some saw David as a calculating deceiver, while others believed he was a desperate man overwhelmed by the pressures of maintaining two families. Inside the courtroom, Emma and Jessica sat on opposite sides, united in betrayal but navigating their own healing journeys. The prosecution laid out their case meticulously, painting David as a man who had orchestrated a years-long scheme of deception and fraud. They presented the financial records, surveillance footage, and loan documents, showing how David juggled two families, accumulated fraudulent debt, and tried to escape when it all unraveled. Emma testified with a calm, quiet strength. "He promised me a future while building one with someone else," she told the jury. "He didn't just lie to me. He built a life I didn't even know existed." Jessica's testimony was equally powerful, exposing how David had manipulated her into believing they had a future. "He said he was divorced, that we were building a life together. I trusted him," she said, her voice breaking. "I never imagined I was just the other woman." The defense, however, argued that David wasn't a criminal mastermind but a man driven to desperate measures. They claimed his fraud was born out of financial pressure, not malice, and that his actions were a misguided attempt to protect his families from ruin. The prosecution countered this narrative, emphasizing that David's choices were deliberate and calculated. He forged documents, deceived banks, and tried to disappear. This wasn't a man overwhelmed by life. This was someone who thought he could outrun the truth. After days of testimony and closing arguments, the jury delivered their verdict. David Peterson was found guilty on multiple counts of fraud, identity theft, and forgery. The judge's sentencing was swift and unsparing. "Mr. Peterson," the judge said, "your actions were not the result of momentary lapses in judgment. They were part of a sustained campaign of deception that caused significant harm." David was sentenced to 20 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 15 years. He was also ordered to pay restitution to Emma and Jessica, compensating them for the financial damage his fraud had caused. With the trial over, the dust began to settle, but the emotional aftermath lingered for everyone involved. Emma moved out of the house she had shared with David, determined to leave behind the ghosts of her old life. The church community, shaken by the public unraveling of David's double life, rallied around Emma, offering her support. Slowly, she began rebuilding her life, not as someone's wife, but as her own person. Jessica, still grappling with the betrayal, focused on healing for herself and her children. She sought therapy and distanced herself from the media attention, determined to move forward. The road to recovery would be long, but she vowed not to let David's deceit define her future. Harper and Miller reflected on the case that had consumed their lives for weeks. "It's strange," Miller said over coffee one afternoon. "David wasn't a violent man, but the damage he caused was just as real." Harper nodded. "Betrayal leaves scars, even if they don't show on the surface. People think lies are harmless until they explode." While the emotional wounds would take time to heal, the detectives knew their work wasn't done. The Financial Crimes Unit continued to investigate Blue Horizon, following the leads uncovered during David's trial. Martin's arrest was only the beginning. Shutting down the entire operation would take time and patience, but Harper and Miller were committed to seeing it through. Weeks later, Emma packed the last of her belongings from the house she once called home. As she stood at the front door, she glanced around one final time, the memories of both happiness and heartbreak lingering in every corner. But this time, there was no bitterness in her heart, only resolve. Harper's words echoed in her mind. Even in the safest places, secrets can tear lives apart. Emma locked the door behind her, leaving the lies and betrayal in the past, ready to step into a future free from deception. The story of David Peterson serves as a haunting reminder that deception can take many forms, often hiding within the relationships we trust the most. His double life not only shattered the lives of Emma and Jessica, but exposed how quickly lies can spiral into crime, desperation, and betrayal. But amidst the heartbreak, there is also hope. Emma and Jessica found the strength to rebuild their lives, proving that even in the darkest moments, it is possible to move forward. Their resilience stands as a testament to the importance of facing the truth, no matter how painful it might be. David's story also serves as a warning. Unchecked trust can be dangerous. In relationships, it's crucial to stay vigilant and pay attention to red flags. Lies have a way of surfacing, and when they do, the fallout can be devastating. What are your thoughts on David Peterson's double life? Do you think Emma did the right thing by exposing him during the Christmas service, or should she have handled it differently? What warning signs would you look for in your own relationships to avoid situations like this? Let us know in the comments below. And if you found this story compelling, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping true crime stories. Tap the notification bell so you never miss an update. More shocking tales are just around the corner. In life, just like in relationships, the truth will always find a way out. Stay alert, stay informed, and we'll see you in the next episode.